So welcome back to Small Things Brought Together, the online ongoing series about cultivating a life of creativity. If you've been following along, we've done about 8 episodes, and I really felt like I got to the end of my ability to just talk myself by myself about this topic. And so I took a few months off to think about how to move forward. And what I decided I would like to do is to bring in other people's voices and artwork to broaden the conversation and um, kind of make it not just about this general idea that we have been exploring, which is that through effort and self-reflection and trust, that we can cultivate our creativity. So there's been one person who has been pivotal to this whole series, as far as I'm concerned, and has, through conversations, has really sparked a lot of my thinking, inspired a lot of my thinking, and that is Shea Zuiko Settimi, and she is here with us today. Woo! So, just by way of introduction, Zuiko is a monastic at Zen Mountain Monastery, which is a Zen Buddhist monastery in upstate New York. And that is where we met. In fact, I was trying to remember the exact time when we met. And I know it's before you were an ordained monastic for sure. Actually, it was even before you had done Jukai and you were Shea. And I was trying to remember, but all I could remember was that in various public forums, you would be the person who would say like the most direct, honest thing. And I was so like, oh my God. I was actually a little scared of you. And impressed, super impressed, like wish I could be more like that. So but that was sort of my first thing, of being a little bit intimidated. And so I can't really remember. You must have made an overture, because I think I was probably a little too scared. So anyway, Zuiko, maybe, yeah, so I wanted you to just say hello and maybe talk a little bit about how, I mean, you can talk about whatever you want, but how art practice, as we call it at Zen Mountain Monastery, fits into Zen training, and why is that? Because as far as I know, it's pretty unique to Zen Mountain Monastery. And then, of course, I want to hear about your own experiences, but we'll get more into that as we go. So, yeah, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that intro. What an introduction. Oh my goodness. And we should, after this, actually talk about, I remember the first time meeting you too. So anyway, so art practice is one of the formal areas of training at Zen Mountain Monastery, developed by the original abbot here, John Dido Laurie. And Zen Mountain Monastery was originally called the Zen Art Center when it was founded in 1980. And Daido Roshi found his way into spiritual practice through creative practice. He was a photographer who studied with Minor White. And so he made that a really pivotal part of the training, right up there with Zazen and every other sort of important area of training that we do. And creative expression actually has a centuries-long history within the Zen tradition, through really refined practices like poetry and tea ceremony and brush painting. And so it does kind of fit in with the Zen tradition, but the way that it's done here, I think, is really unique. And I think that Daido Roshi, and since his passing, Hojin Sensei, who's one of the teachers here, who was a working artist when she came to the monastery, really carry that forward as a way you know, if we think of all the different areas of training at the monastery as taking zazen and kind of turning it, like turning the jewel. So art practice is just kind of taking the practice of seated meditation and turning it a little bit. And it's sort of another access point into studying the self or studying the mind. And so one way that that happens here explicitly is that twice a year we're given an art practice assignment. The whole sort of community takes that up in whatever way. And so when I initially started, when I fell into sort of the art practice wormhole, I had been doing art practice as part of my formal practice and training for about 10 years. And sort of picking it up and doing it different media. I had done like clay and movement and some visual art, but mostly writing because that was sort of my thing. And so I had already been, it's interesting to look back and be like, well, I had been doing it for 10 years before I started like really doing it.
Meaning like, so this was a question I had. So when you were, I'm assuming like most kids, we all kind of make art at school or whatever, but was art making a part of your life before you came to the monastery?
You know, I can remember as a kid, like writing a book, you know, it was like ballpoint pen and notebook paper with little illustrations and a story. But I don't remember really being that creative of a kid. And I actually, you know, in high school, I took arts and crafts for like a couple years with this really great art teacher and learned like linoleum block printing and hand building clay stuff, and I really loved that. And I took an actual art class in high school, and I was terrible at it. I couldn't render anything. I couldn't draw. I didn't have the patience to really learn how to draw. And writing, sort of expressing myself through writing, was sort of the most natural medium that I had, and that's really where I felt most comfortable, like for years, and actually still do, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So then you came, so when you talked about you had been doing it for 10 years, meaning like as a more informed, like I don't live at the monastery, but I still do the art practice assignments, you know, but obviously not as formally as a resident would who's living at the monastery. So is that what you meant? Like you were taking it up as you were, and then you moved to the monastery.
Yeah, I moved to the monastery, and we would get time on the training schedule, a couple hours a week to do art practice. And so I was basically kind of, you know, working within that period of time. I don't really remember, you know, until a couple years ago, doing art practice like on my own free time. It was sort of like, this is the time that we have to do it. And I would sort of take it up that way because we had to present something.
Right.
You know, so you had to have something to show for it. So yeah.
I mean, and that's actually a very interesting piece of it, is if you're in residence and you're there for the art presentation, like you have to show something. And I mean, you know, as somebody has had art part of my life since I was tiny, can't remember it not being. So like for me, that just feels like, yeah, well, of course. But, you know, having been in residence and talked to people, it's like for some people, that's a major thing to overcome.
And it's a major thing to overcome. And it's so, you know, like in residency, I'm like living with these people every day. We're like eating together and sitting together, working together. And then all of a sudden you see their mind in like a photograph or a, you know, a poetry reading or a drawing. And it's like, oh, like you're this too. Such an incredible and very like intimate and vulnerable way to like see someone, you know,
Mm.
especially like so many people here are not trained artists. Most people are not trained artists. And so everyone's kind of like out on a limb together and, you know, showing themselves.
Yeah, I mean, so since I've had the privilege to be part of this whole experience, I feel like in a way, it's almost ruined me to go around and look at galleries in New York City because there's such a like sincerity and vulnerability in the work, even if it's just like this very faint little pencil drawing, you know, that you can barely see because the person was so nervous, you know, and but like it's so heartbreakingly beautiful that they've like did it, that to go in a gallery and see some really kind of like ironic, cynical, it's like, yeah, I can't even, you know, so it's so moving. It so can be such a moving experience.
Definitely.
So I created a little PowerPoint of your work, and I do want to say that Zuiko has one of my all-time favorite Instagram feeds. And so I highly recommend that you go and look her up and follow her on Instagram because she generously posts it's pretty much regular, something like at least once a week, maybe more, uh, images of your ongoing work process. So,
And,
yeah.
you know, actually, before you do that, I wanted to, because I realized I was sort of thinking about it, you know, how did I come to sort of make the first things that you're actually going to show? And they were things I didn't actually photograph. And it was early 2017. It was like the winter of 2017. And I was going through something and I needed some way to try to be inside of what I was going through. It was unfamiliar. And so I didn't want to write, I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want any kind of verbal discursive anything. And I was like, well, I can't draw and I can't paint. So I started collaging. You know, I would go through magazines and cut out things and put them together in these different ways. And it was sort of like this really early way that I started making visual art, and mostly out of just like I don't know how to, I don't have any skill to render anything. And I realized that through collage, that there was a way to like create a sense or a feeling, and not like a feeling necessarily like an emotion, but you know, writing and for I'm not a poet, I'm not that kind of writer. So language is about being extremely precise, finding the perfect word that expresses exactly what I mean. And I needed something that was like not so nailed down, something that was more something that I didn't even understand what I was doing completely. And that was sort of the beginning. So I just wanted to sort of set the stage there, that that's kind of how I started.
I love that. I love that so much. You know, so I've been teaching, I'm just going to, while I start the screen share, I've been teaching this Yoga Sutra introductory course. And we've been talking about in the Yoga Sutra, Patanjali identifies 5 activities of the mind, one of which is imagination. And so when the object isn't there, so you don't have a direct sensory relationship with the object. And my primary yoga teacher really is like, this is about language. This is about language. And I'm like, I'm not sure about that, you know, like there's also something else. So let's see. I'm going to start. So based on some images that Zuiko shared with me and some, well, you shared with me like 327 images and then some additional ones too. So I culled, I think I took all the ones you directly shared and then I culled a bunch from the other ones. But so what is this image that we're looking at now?
So this is a foil paper mosaic. It's about 6 by 6 inches on tar paper. And what happened when I started doing collage, as happens, I think, when you start making, is that materials start just sort of coming to you. And Hojin Sensei, for my birthday, gave me a book of foil paper samples from the 1960s. This sample book she bought at a yard sale like 20 years before and had hung on to, had almost given to other people many times, but hadn't. And she gave it to me. And this was like a magical thing. I would cut up these papers in little 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch squares and sort them into colored piles and use like a dental pick and Mod Podge to like make these pieces. And like, it was the most pleasurable, like absorbing activity. And it was when it opened the door of to art practice as pleasure, like pleasure as a gateway to creative expression, which I had never experienced before, even, or perhaps especially through writing. Like, it was never pleasurable. It was always like going for a run. Like, you're happy to have done it, but the doing it wasn't pleasurable. But this was extremely pleasurable. So this was a really like pivotal turn.
I love that. I remember this was not the first one that I saw, just like around the, I don't know, the women's changing area or something. It was like, I saw one that was more landscape looking, and it was like, oh my God, who did that? Like, it was so amazing in its intricacy. And yeah, especially as someone who's not into that level of detail, it's like, wow. So it's very exciting to hear you describe, you know, it as a pleasurable experience, because, you know, that's just so exciting. And just for me personally, like, that kind of thing feels not pleasurable.
Yeah, mosaic is like a control freaks medium. It's really like, as a triple Capricorn, of course it was going to be mosaic to start with. Yeah.
I love that. So then what's this one?
So people looked at the paper mosaics and they kept saying, like, you should do mosaic, you should do mosaic. And I recognize this thing in me. When people would do that, I would be like, I don't feel like doing like, thanks, but no thanks. Like, I'm like, shut up, you know? And I kept resisting and resisting and resisting, as you'll appreciate. And finally one day I went online, and because mosaics to me were patio tables and backsplashes, like white grout, kind of crafty sort of things. And I went online, I did a search for mosaic art and came across an artist named Sonia King. She's a mosaic artist out of Dallas, Texas. And I found an hour-long talk that she gave at some British mosaic conference where she talked about her work. And I was riveted. One, because I didn't understand that mosaic could be fine art. And her work, I thought, was so beautiful. And so, talk about control freak. Oh my God. And just the way that she talked about art practice, I was like, oh, this is art practice. Like, I understand what she's talking about. And so that's when I discovered Instagram, and I started finding all these other mosaic artists. And this piece was really pivotal, because I just remember being like, I have no idea what I'm doing, and I'm going to just figure it out. And that was not a way of being that I had never experienced myself that way before, ever. I was never the type of person that's like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm sure I'll just figure it out. That was not me. So this was like another huge gate opening of like, I have so much inspiration and desire in me that like, I'm gonna just do it. And you can see there's thin set I got thin set all over some of the stones. I mean, it's a hot mess, and I love this piece because it was just kind of like, I don't care, you know, I'm just doing it.
Ugh, that makes me like get chills and want to cry. It's so exciting. So exciting. Oh, so and so good for you that you stepped into it. So this piece, what is this piece?
So this is another mosaic in the style called picassiette, which means broken plates. And it's a whole way of, a mosaic, there's a sort of ladies who lunch kind of mosaic artwork that uses super expensive materials. Italian glass costs a fortune. And this was made from a broken plate that I found on one of my walks around the monastery. I just picked up all the pieces and made this. And so it was sort of really, I became really interested in mosaic as being sort of like you could forage materials, you could use broken things. The artists who I really loved forged their own materials. That's another way that it's sort of a control freak medium, is that you forge your materials, you cut your own materials. You don't buy anything sort of ready-made. And so this was, I think I was kind of just exploring visual language. I had no visual art training at all. And I think I was just starting to play and understand how to create movement in a visual language.
Can I just, as a side note, when you described it as like the ladies who lunch, and it's like, I know exactly what you're talking about. But then I was like, oh, I don't know that I ever thought of mosaic as like a female dominated genre of art. Is that true? Or, I mean, is it just that I know the artists that you've shown me, I think, are all women. So is that just because it happens to be your particular area of interest, or would you say that's true?
I would say in the United States, it is mosaic as fine art is primarily women.
Mm-hmm.
Many of those women have trained in Italy, where all the masters pretty much are men.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very gendered. I think it's very much more male dominated outside the United States. Definitely all the artists who I think are super interesting are either American or Canadian women.
Mm-hmm. So interesting. So then there's this piece, which I know there's like a lot of time and space between the one we just saw and this one. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that one.
So this is the last mosaic that I have made. I haven't made anything since this. It took, I don't know, 125 hours to make this. And that's just because I'm not that, like a mosaic artist who'd been making for a decade. It would not have taken that long. But this, a woman who lives nearby here, who's an architect, dropped off this little bag of 3x3 porcelain tile samples and said, can you use these? And I let them sit there forever. And then I went and cut them open and realized they were dyed all the way through. And I was like, oh my God, this material is so beautiful. And so I chopped it all up and hand built the substrate. I remember talking to you about this piece before I started working on it. I was so afraid I was going to ruin it because I didn't really know what I was doing. And it kind of almost made itself. Like, yes, it took 125 hours, but the fact that it ended up being with kind of a perfectly spaced border around it. And I mean, I don't know how any of that happened, really. And I feel like I exercised something that like really needed to like come to some kind of completion with this piece. I'm not saying I'm done with mosaic forever. I'm done with it for now, and sort of finishing this piece was like a really important part of that. And I just want to acknowledge my mosaic mentor and one of my important creative mentors, Rachel Sager, who I she's this incredible mosaic artist in Western Pennsylvania. And I went out and did some private instruction with her and learned everything that's in this piece. I learned from her, and just feel like I need to give her credit for really teaching me so many things about mosaic and just about life.
Mm. Mm. Excuse me. I guess, because I have only, I have no one, everything I know about mosaic, you've told me. So, and that still isn't, that much. So when I look at this, it's, unless if you hadn't told me all of that, I don't know if I would fully get why this piece is actually as complicated as it is, because, excuse me, you know, because to my eyes of ignorance, it's like, yeah, you just put one stick, one stone, one stone, one stone, one stone, but it's not like that.
Well,
It isn't.
there's a couple things about it. If you want to see a piece, actually the piece that inspired this piece is a piece called Monument by Braun, and she's a master. So if you want to see what executing this would look like done by a master, look at her piece Monument. And sort of the interesting thing to me about this piece was learning how the bands of color are horizontal, but the lines are built vertically. And there's certain classical rules to the mosaic line, which is referred to as andamento. And these are the rules that I learned from Rachel Sager. And for a mosaic to kind of work and be pleasing, the andamento has to either observe the rules or break them in such a flawless way that the eye is fooled into thinking that it's following the rules. And so that's kind of, it is deceptively sort of simple, but it is, I think the thing about mosaic that was so important for me to pick up kind of first as a real medium is that it's very slow. From the forging to the cutting, the sorting, the mixing of the cement, it's so slow. And I think I needed that as an initial medium, to really have time to when something doesn't come naturally, I think slowing down can really help, and mosaic will just slow you down, or it slowed me down.
It's so interesting because I feel like there's also a bit of a balance, because like, especially I remember us talking about this piece in particular, and it's like, at what point does that slowness actually kind of make you stop? Like there's a way of that it suddenly is like, well, it's not just slow, but in fact means you won't actually do it.
Yeah.
So it is kind of funny to me now, as you're saying that too, to think, well, what was the next thing you picked up, which was watercolor, which is kind of like the fastest thing on earth. And so I guess this is a good spot, because I think the next one is your first painting. And I so remember our conversations around you saying, well, I can't draw. I think you even said, I hate drawing. And I'm not a painter and I hate drawing. And it was like, wow, okay, sounds like you better start doing it immediately. So what, again, like, and I, knowing you, like, taking a plunge into the unknown isn't exactly your comfort zone.
No, it's not. I think, I was thinking about this, how did I get started painting? And I remember Michelle Spark, she's an artist who I also know from the monastery, sent me the work of, I'm sorry, I can't remember if she's from Argentina or Chile. Her name's Francisca Sutil, and her pieces are made by repeated mark making with a brush. And I remember looking at it and being like, wait a minute, does that count as painting? Like, it blew open this door of like permission of like, well, who says that, like, what is drawing? Like, does that mean making something that looks like something? Like, I think that mark making, I hadn't understood what that was, or what that could be. And to me, there was such a deep connection between mark making and Zazen, that I just felt like here was another whole realm of
Can you explain more
exploration.
about that, like mark making and zazen?
Well, looking at Francisca Sutil's paintings, I mean, some of them are very large scale. And so they're like thousands of she dips a brush in paint and she presses it onto the paper. And she just does that. That's what the whole painting is. And so and I'm not, I mean, I don't know enough about painting to say anything more about it than that. But, when you're doing a repetitive mark making like that, then what comes to the fore is, at least for me, sort of like, well, I mean, what is Zazen is just like being with your breath or your whatever your practice is over and over and over and over again. And you either, through the repetition, you either die or become dead, or you come to life. And usually it's some combination of both of those things. And so visual mark making became sort of an externalization of the process of Zazen. I could literally see my mind. And this was something that I could see in mosaic, because your mind shows up there too. But this was so much sort of quicker and more direct, and it took me a long time to sort of go back and be like, I think it really helped me emotionally regulate. Like, I think it really helped me relax. I remember reading that they did some sort of study or experiment where they looked at people's brain waves while they were doing mosaic, and their brain waves are very similar to those that you would find in a meditator. And so I think there's something about art practice in general that, because meditation requires that you're sort of still and not moving, the form is very tight, that externalizing that process through materials and mark making, I don't know, I kind of just met that language at the right time. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually making me think about, again, this idea that it's like although we talk about it in terms of language, like a visual vocabulary or something, but in another way, just like in Zazen, it's beyond language. And so it is tapping into another way of being and seeing and communicating, even, which is a funny thing to think about in Zazen, but I know it's true, like that doesn't use language, so interesting. Wow. All right. Kind of blowing my mind. So this was another one that you had pointed out in the group that you sent. So
Yeah, I did a whole ton of these, and this is somehow, at the same time I was doing these, I discovered contemporary Aboriginal women's painting in Australia, and felt like these paintings felt like they weren't, I don't know who was making them, was my feeling when I was making them, was that they were, these pieces gave me some sense of, what I have heard a lot of artists talk about. Elizabeth Gilbert talks about it in her book, Big Magic. She actually gave a TED talk about creativity, this idea of sort of like the individual artist who, like, it's their creation, it's mine. These pieces were basically like, these are not mine. I mean, these are coming from something that is so much larger than me, and I'm just channeling something and like available to like keep doing it. And I remember thinking at a certain point, like, I should start making other kinds of paintings. And then I was like, why should I? Who cares if this is the painting I make for the rest of my life? Like, you know, I was so given so much life by it. And I dreamt about these Aboriginal women and read all about them, and you know, saw that the creative impulse, the art making impulse, is so incredibly ancient, and was so not considered a personal achievement until really quite recently. And so these were just really important in the sense of like, okay, this is just me showing up every day. And I think that's what having a decade of Zen practice gave me, is the discipline to show up every day and trust what was happening. Yeah. So these are more.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I did cull some out, but I had chosen this one before you sent the other one. So I was like, oh, yeah, yeah.
I just did another one this weekend. I was feeling a little stuck a little bit, and I was like, why don't we just go back to that? It was like right there for me, you know? Yeah.
I mean, it's so funny, isn't it, that like we're doing something and it's working great, and our first, maybe one of our first thoughts is like, well, what else should I be doing? You know? Like, it's yeah, it's such a funny. So like I said, I kind of curated these in a way that makes sense to me. So the next few are these that lose that more fluid and become more grid like. This one, I couldn't decide if you put the dots on after or if they were the result of a grid making experiment. I don't know if it matters, but
Yeah, that was like a watercolor wash. These are all watercolor washes with just acrylic dot, you know, paint dots applied afterwards,
uh-huh.
using a skewer of some kind.
Oh, okay, so not a brush.
Correct.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and these are just super meditative, just super like calming for me to work on.
And they're all, I'm guessing they're, what are they, like 5 by 7 or
Yeah,
8?
5 by 7.
But this is bigger, I think.
Yeah, this is this might be a 9 by 12 wooden board. I think that's the measurement. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But it's on wood.
Yeah.
Is that acrylic paint then?
Yeah, I love acrylic paint, but my cabin doesn't have running water, so it's not super practical for me to work with.
Mm. Mm. Oh, and then to get more images in. So you also like these and some more coming up are like ones, these are obviously your sketchbook, but you also have painted in books.
Yes.
And so I don't know if there's like the other ones is because they each have that border, I'm assuming you're like taping down so that they don't get warped. So these are maybe a little less formal even.
Those are like, I paint my sketchbook when I have to go down to Brooklyn and I can't bring all my stuff. I just pack my little travel set. And I mean, honestly, I remember very distinctly painting these during a time when I was super anxious.
Hmm.
And I would just sit there and paint these, and it would like calm me down.
Hmm. Hmm. Oh, and then this is your this book, which was like some kind of medical health or mental health book or something.
Yeah, it was a DSM manual.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that cautionary statement, especially. um, so yeah, then I thought, well, then there was some where your marks actually feel very objecty. So even the
Mm.
ones with the dots on top, I feel like those, it's almost more like the mark becomes like a pattern, or there's like through repetition it becomes an overall feeling, but some of the pieces felt like the marks themselves became objects. So,
Huh.
so I kind of separated out a few that I put in that category.
The one with the indigo on the right, I took a couple online um, painting classes with a woman named Laura Horn. And I really like her. I just like her style. Her classes were really inexpensive. And she uses Teachable as a platform, which I really like. And she was really good at just sort of explaining how different materials work and talking about her process as she painted. And I feel like I actually learned a lot from her just in the few courses that I took. As you know, because you and I talked about it, I got a little stuck in I need to do what she's doing. How do I do what she's doing? And it took a little while to actually kind of fall into my own way. But I still am really glad that she introduced me to the watercolor paints that I use that I love. So I got a lot out of that. It just took a while to kind of be like, I don't have to be her.
I mean, I feel like some people spend their whole life learning that lesson. In like a couple weeks is kind of amazing. So then these were some others that I saw, like the mark as object. Again, me just like imposing some rules on things. I like this one way over on the right because it's such a little oddball one, you know?
People love that one. It's so funny to me. That was totally copying this woman who I follow on Instagram. Gosh, I wish I could remember her name. She makes really, really amazing, gorgeous ones, but she just puts a ton of water on the paper and then just drops ink into it. And, I just kind of wanted to see what would happen. But yeah, that was a real crowd pleaser, actually.
That's funny. I was like, oh, it's a little oddball over here.
Agreed.
And then you had selected this one, so I was curious to hear what made you single this one out.
I gave that to my uncle for Christmas, and I remember when I gave it to him in my mind thinking, you better like this because this is the best one. I had painted a whole bunch of paintings for family and friends for the holidays, and I don't know why I love this one so much, but I do. I can't explain it, but there's something extremely satisfying to me about it. That's all I have to say about it.
Fair enough. So in my little pretend a mind's eye of understanding your work, I saw these also as a bit of a transition between like the dot mark making and the ones that come next, which are these like total color field fluid images. So it was like to me these felt a little transitional, actually. I don't know if you at all see them that way, but yeah, because then so like to go back.
Yeah, these are actually later, and this is what I tend to do when I've messed up a painting to try to kind of recover it. I do this. So these are usually, not always, but often I've made some sort of mistake, or I think it's a mistake, and so this is what I do with it. The next ones you were going to show, those indigo, those are super early.
Okay.
Those are. I had one tube of watercolor paint. Indigo was the first color I bought. It was the only color I had for a while. And so this was me just kind of like figuring out how watercolor works.
That's so cool. I actually think it's a really, I mean, I don't know whether you did it just out of necessity, but it's a really good idea to like limit the number of elements when you're trying to figure something out. Just because more is more, you know?
Yeah, I remember Hojin Sensei saying that to me. She said, in the beginning, it's like you need all the colors because you don't understand the language yet. You don't know that when you really learn something, you can say everything you need to say with one or two colors. I think that's really true.
Yeah, like the virtuosity. Mm.
Yeah.
This one is just, it to me, it's like the previous one. You do sometimes reference landscape fairly
Yeah.
often.
Yeah.
But then I guess I thought, well, there's something so beautiful about even letting go of that reference and just letting it be what it is. I think this is a very beautiful painting.
Mm.
Oh, and I had to include this one.
Yeah. So this was part of that breakthrough of like, I'm not Laura Horn, I'm me. And I remember emailing you sort of the next morning. I had been goofing around in my cabin and just, you know, on and on and on. And then boom, like it was like, oh, it was such a visceral, it was like a whole body and mind experience of just like, this is what I am trying to do without even knowing that I was trying to do it. And I really just loved, I mean, this captures such a moment for me, of like, and that's the other benefit of having all of that experience with meditation is that, you know, you don't know when a turn is going to happen. You know, you may be stuck in something really for quite a long time that is miserable or boring or whatever. And you never know. And if you don't show up, it won't happen. So I'm a big believer in just goofing off, and in times, fallow times, or when I'm sort of stuck, of just doing something that I find really pleasurable, and trusting that the turn will come. But I'm glad you included that.
Yeah, because I am the lucky owner of this painting. Yeah, and so I also, that idea of like sometimes you move away from like a horizon line, although this I can even see a little bit maybe, but and then the colors become their own subject matter. Even the one over on the right where whether you just rinsed it with a lot of water or whether there was some scrubbing or not, I think it's really interesting, and it's like I like the idea that you return to pleasure as like a guidepost. It's a really good one.
Yeah. Yeah, some of these, I feel like if I had a different life where I could like build my own studio and just like paint all day, I would be doing like experiments with oil paint and cold wax. But I don't have that. And it's probably good. I'm sort of limited in my materials, so I'm kind of feel like sometimes the watercolor artist who wished that she was an oil painter, and try to sometimes get those effects with watercolor paint.
Well, I mean, that like luminosity is definitely the word that comes to mind. So, and I know oil paint has that, like, in a way, I almost feel like when I hear you say that, I'm almost like, no, 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 because, it's easy to get seduced. And I think what really stands out in these watercolors is like, clearly you are in 100% engaged with the medium, but I don't feel you're seduced by it.
Mm.
Because it there's a prettiness that can happen sometimes with watercolor, and because it is very luminous, and but I don't feel that in these, even though I think they're beautiful. It's not that kind of like pretty sweet thing.
Yeah.
And then this was one that you described as your favorite.
Yeah, this is, I don't know why. It's, sometimes I let people, pick a painting out of my stack, and I reserve the right to like not let them have it if it's this one. Or, there's something about this, like, who painted that? Like, I don't remember painting that. I don't, um, but I don't know. I can't even explain what I like about it really, but I really love it. And it's two colors. It's two tubes of paint, that made that. And yeah, I really, really love it.
I mean, that's such a good lesson, especially as I sit here in my studio surrounded by materials. It's like, yeah, sometimes less is more. Less is more. So I really love this one too.
Mm.
Very simple, but there is this depth that you get with the medium that's really lovely.
Part of that, I just want to say, is I use really like high quality artist grade watercolor paints that are outrageously expensive and worth every penny, because um, although, when I work with the residents at the monastery, I work with the new residents doing art practice, and we paint out of those little plastic tray, and it's given me real appreciation. You can do quite a bit with those,
Yeah,
actually.
yeah.
And it's nice to kind of revisit that, but like really the it gives the high quality watercolor really gives a lot of room to um, explore the material, which I really love to do. One of my things that I tell the residents is to constantly ask the question, because a lot of them haven't used watercolor before and they're kind of like, I don't know what to do. And I suggest to them asking the question, what does this do? What does this do? What happens when and that's a lot of what these paintings, these watercolor paintings are just turning the board and then coming back in 10 minutes and turning it 90 degrees again and letting it drip more. And, it's a lot of just over futzing or under futzing, and just really seeing like, what does the paint want to do?
Mm, mm,
It's the opposite of mosaic, where you really have to control it or it's not going to be successful.
mm.
You have to really, but with watercolor, I feel like I see watercolor artists who paint these hyper realistic, amazing, I'm like, oh my God, but for me, watercolor is really about trust, of like, because you don't even know what it's going to be until it dries completely. You don't even know what it's going to look like when you
Right.
think it's finished. And then you come back in the morning and you're like, oh, you're this. Okay. Yeah.
That's so awesome.
I painted that in a moment of such, I mean, you know me personally, what my life has been like recently. That was a moment of such deep, like, fear and despair and just agony. And
Mm,
that's Payne's Gray and nothing else.
mm,
And I felt like it was really great to kind of look at that and be like, yep, that's the internal landscape right
mm,
now.
mm. I almost was like, should I really end with this one? I thought, yes.
I love that. I love that painting. It's
Yeah.
light and dark. It's light and dark together,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Move us here. All right. Well, I think this is, unless you have more to say, I think we'll close.
This was so fun. Thank you.
Thank you. So inspirational, and yeah, so much there. I actually tried to write down some of the names as you were saying them of the people who have been influential to you. And so maybe what I'll do when I get this all edited and put up is maybe make some links. So if people are interested, they can follow those links.
Yeah, I mean, there's some really great artists to check out. So, yeah, that's a good idea.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yeah, we'll see you next month. Ooh.